The room was never meant to witness history. No cameras, no official seals, no carefully prepared statements for the public record, just a dimly lit study late at night, somewhere far from power, where the walls had heard decades of silence and were about to hear a truth that had been buried for a generation. An old man sat alone at a heavy wooden desk. His posture was still disciplined, almost rigid, as if the habit of command had never left him. But his hands betrayed him. They rested on a faded photograph, edges worn soft by time. In it were younger men, confident men, men who believed the war had ended when the guns went quiet. He stared at the image longer than necessary. Outside, the world remembered him as a symbol of balance, restraint, and victory. The leader who kept alliances intact, the man who chose caution over chaos. History books praised his judgment. Statues honored his calm. But history had never asked him the question that haunted his nights. What if restraint had cost the world its future? He exhaled slowly, as if releasing a weight he had carried alone for decades. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, not weak, but burdened. "We missed it," he said. He didn't. The words were not dramatic. They were devastating. This was not a confession made for redemption. It was an admission born of clarity that arrived too late. An acknowledgement that the man once dismissed as reckless had understood something fundamental, something about power, territory, and the brutal honesty of history in that quiet room, without witnesses or records. A truth surfaced that had the power to change how an entire war would be remembered. If you're drawn to the untold moments of history, the ones that never made it into textbooks, subscribe, update to this channel, and support our work. Your support helps us continue uncovering stories that still shape the world today. Before we go on, let me ask you this question. Do you believe history is shaped more by bold action or careful restraint? A. Bold action. B. Careful restraint. Comment A or B below, and let's see where you stand. They were shaped by the same war, yet forged into opposite answers to the same question. Both men carried the burden of command, but they carried it differently. One believed leadership meant balance, holding together fragile alliances, absorbing political pressure, and choosing the path that minimized visible risk. He understood that wars could be lost not only on battlefields, but in conference rooms, where unity could fracture as easily as glass. To him, restraint was not weakness, it was responsibility. The other believed leadership meant motion, relentless, decisive, unapologetic motion. He trusted momentum the way sailors trust the wind, knowing that once it died, no amount of discipline could summon it back. He had watched armies hesitate before and understood the cost. Delay was never neutral. It always favored someone, and it was rarely the side that waited. They did not argue over loyalty or courage. Both had plenty of each. Their conflict was deeper than tactics. It was philosophical. The cautious commander saw the war as a problem to be solved cleanly. Defeat the enemy, maintain cooperation, and allow diplomacy to restore order afterward. He believed the future could be negotiated once victory was secured. The bold general saw something else entirely. He believed the future was already being written by the movement of armies, that borders would harden where boots stopped, that power respected facts on the ground, not promises made afterward. To him, the war did not end at surrender. It merely changed form. Neither man was blind, neither was foolish. One feared catastrophe if control was lost. The other feared a quieter disaster if opportunity was wasted. History often simplifies such conflicts into right and wrong. But in real time, they existed as two men staring at the same horizon and seeing entirely different storms gathering beyond it. And only one of them believed the next war had already begun. Autumn arrived with a strange feeling at the front, one that soldiers rarely trusted, but immediately recognized. The air no longer felt heavy with uncertainty. It felt thin, brittle, As if the enemy's grip on the war had begun to crack. The roads ahead told the story before intelligence reports did. Resistance was uneven. Units surrendered more quickly. The enemy's movements lacked confidence, as though they were reacting rather than planning. For men who had fought inch by inch for months, this sudden looseness was unmistakable. Something was giving way. The bold general sensed it with almost physical clarity. Momentum, he believed, was not measured in miles, but in psychology. Once an enemy accepted that defeat was inevitable. Speed became more powerful than firepower. Every hour mattered. Every pause gave the illusion that collapse was not as complete as it truly was. To him, this season was not just another phase of the campaign. It was the window, the brief, unforgiving moment when history allowed itself to be pushed. He spoke of the war as if it were holding its breath. Either it would be forced to exhale into final defeat, or it would inhale again and survive. Among the troops, hope mixed with exhaustion. Letters home spoke of a war that finally seemed within reach of ending. There was talk, quiet but persistent, that Christmas might be spent somewhere other than a foxhole. But autumn does not wait. It passes quickly, indifferent to hesitation. What the bold general feared most was not enemy resistance, but the slow erosion of opportunity, the kind that disappears without warning and never announces its absence until it is gone. He believed this was the moment that separated victory from consequence, not whether the war would be won, but how, and what kind of world would rise from its ashes. From the command centers, far behind the front, the war no longer looked fragile, it looked complex. Maps covered the tables, layered with lines, arrows, and numbers that told a different story than the dust-covered roads seen by the men at the front. Fuel calculations replaced battlefield instinct. Supply routes mattered as much as enemy positions. Every decision carried the weight of thousands of lives and the risk of public failure. The cautious commander understood this burden intimately. He had seen how quickly momentum could become disaster if an army outran its lifelines. One broken bridge, one counterattack, one political fracture within the alliance, and a daring advance could turn into catastrophe. History was unforgiving to leaders who gambled and lost. There were other pressures as well, spoken softly but felt constantly. Allies demanded reassurance that no single nation would claim glory at the expense of unity. Political leaders wanted progress without headlines that read like recklessness. Victory had to be shared, orderly and controlled, so the decision that emerged felt responsible. Advance on multiple fronts, spread the risk, keep everyone moving, no one exposed. It was a strategy built to prevent failure rather than invite brilliance. On paper, it was elegant, balanced, defensible. The cautious commander believed he was protecting not just an army, but a fragile coalition that could fracture under the strain of uneven sacrifice. He chose certainty over speed, cohesion over concentration. He chose a path that history, at the time, applauded. What he could not calculate was the cost of time itself, because some decisions are not remembered for the dangers they avoided, but for the possibilities they quietly buried. And in choosing the safest path forward, the war continued, carrying consequences that no map on the table could fully reveal. The bold general accepted the order, but he did not accept its silence. Outwardly, he complied. Commands were followed. Movements were adjusted. Discipline, to him, was not optional. It was the spine of an army. Yet beneath that obedience lived a growing frustration, sharpened by the certainty that the moment was slipping away. He spoke only where he believed it still mattered. Late at night, in briefings with trusted officers, in clipped remarks that carried more urgency than anger, his message was always the same. Time was not neutral. Every pause strengthened someone else. Every delay gave the enemy space to breathe, reorganize, and recover their nerve. What unsettled others was not his tone, but his perspective. He was no longer speaking solely about defeating the enemy in front of them. He spoke about what would come after, about who would occupy cities when the war ended, about flags raised not in victory, but in permanence. To many, this sounded dangerously political. Field commanders were expected to fight wars, not predict the world that followed them. His warnings felt uncomfortable, even inappropriate, in a system that prized order and restraint. But the bold general had learned something brutal from experience. Wars did not end cleanly. They bled into the future. He believed the next conflict was already forming in the shadows of the current one, and that refusing to acknowledge it did not prevent it. It guaranteed it. He was not reckless with lives. He was reckless with illusions, and that distinction made him difficult to manage, easy to dismiss, and impossible to ignore. Because while others spoke of logistics and balance, he spoke of consequence, and once spoken, those words could not be unheard. Beneath the thunder of artillery and the roar of engines, another war was being fought, one without gunfire, one that would outlast the sound of the last shot. This war was about geography. The cautious commander understood firepower. He trusted that once the enemy was defeated, lines could be drawn, agreements signed, and order restored through negotiation. To him, maps were temporary tools, meant to be revised when diplomacy took over. The battlefield was a means to an end, not the end itself. The bold general saw the map differently. He did not see borders as abstract ideas waiting to be debated. He saw them as the inevitable result of movement and presence. Armies, he believed, were not just instruments of destruction. They were instruments of definition. Wherever they stopped, reality solidified. He spoke often about cities, river crossings, and rail hubs, not as tactical objectives alone, but as political facts waiting to be claimed. Guns won battles, but geography decided futures. A city liberated too late would not be liberated at all. A capital reached second would belong to someone else forever. This was the war inside the war, the struggle between those who believed power could be shared after victory, and those who believed power belonged to whoever arrived first. The bold general argued that agreements without leverage were wishes, and wishes had no place in history. To many, this thinking felt cold, even cynical, but it was rooted in a hard truth learned from centuries of conflict. The world is shaped less by intentions than by positions. The cautious commander sought a just peace through cooperation. The bold general sought a lasting peace through presence. And between those two visions lay the fault line upon which the post-war world would ultimately fracture. The cost did not arrive all at once. It revealed itself slowly, in fragments, in details that were easy to explain away, until they were no longer isolated incidents, but a pattern. The enemy, once disoriented, began to stiffen. Units that had been retreating now held their ground. Defensive positions appeared where intelligence had predicted emptiness. The war, which had seemed on the verge of collapse, regained its rhythm of resistance. Time had given it that gift. For the cautious commander, these developments were troubling but manageable. War was never linear. Setbacks were expected. Adjustments could be made. The broader strategy remained intact. For the bold general, it was exactly what he had warned would happen. Every day of delay was paid for in blood and exhaustion. Soldiers who might have been home were instead ordered back into frozen fields and ruined towns. Battles that did not need to be fought became unavoidable. The human cost of restraint was no longer theoretical. It was being written into casualty lists and telegrams sent to grieving families. The bold general did not claim that waiting caused defeat. Victory would still come, but it would come heavier, slower, and far more expensive than it needed to be. And worse, it would come after the moment of true leverage had passed. What hurt most was not that time had been lost, but that it had been given away to an enemy that knew how to use it. Waiting had allowed not just military recovery, but political positioning. Forces moved into places that would not be easily surrendered later. The war was being won, but the peace was being compromised. In that realization lay the quiet tragedy of delay. The understanding that some costs are not counted in battles lost or won, but in futures quietly narrowed, while leaders convince themselves there is still time. When the guns finally fell silent, the world expected relief. What it received instead was uncertainty dressed as peace. Cities celebrated liberation with parades and flags. But behind the music lay an unease few dared to name. New uniforms replaced old ones. Checkpoints remained. Promises of freedom were spoken confidently, then postponed indefinitely. The war had ended, yet control had merely changed hands. The cautious commander initially believed this was the necessary aftermath of conflict. Order, he reasoned, required patience. Agreements would be honored. Temporary arrangements would give way to self-determination. History, after all, had rules. The bold general saw something darker forming. He recognized the pattern immediately. Occupation hardening into permanence. Authority justified by sacrifice. Power enforced not through open violence, but through quiet exclusion and fear. The liberation many had imagined was slipping away, replaced by a different kind of captivity for millions. The end of the war did not bring choice. It brought borders they did not draw and futures they did not vote for. Trains still moved, but not freely. Voices still spoke, but more carefully. Hope survived, but cautiously, like a flame shielded from the wind. What made this moment so painful was its inevitability. Once troops settled in, once administrations were installed, the possibility of reversal vanished. No declaration could undo what presence had already decided. The bold general's warnings echoed without him needing to repeat them. The cautious commander began to understand that peace was not defined by silence, but by who controlled it. The world that emerged from the war was not simply divided, it was shaped, quietly, decisively, by where armies had stopped when they believed their job was finished. The change did not come as a revelation. It came as erosion. At first, the cautious commander defended the outcome with the same calm logic that had guided his decisions during the war. Circumstances had been complex, alliances fragile, risks unavoidable. History, he believed, would understand the constraints under which he had operated. But history does not speak all at once. It whispers, persistently. Reports arrived that unsettled him. Agreements interpreted narrowly. Access denied. Elections delayed, then quietly abandoned. The language of cooperation gave way to the language of control. Each development, taken alone, could be explained. Together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. What troubled him most was not that events had turned out poorly, but that they had unfolded exactly as the bold general had warned. The words once dismissed as impatience now read like foresight. The cautions once labeled political now appeared painfully strategic. In private correspondence, his tone began to shift. Confidence softened into reflection. Certainty gave way to questions he never voiced aloud. He replayed meetings in his mind, reconsidered decisions once thought final, and wondered whether restraint had crossed the line into miscalculation. This was not regret fueled by pride or public criticism. It was the quieter, heavier kind, born when a leader realizes that success and consequence are not the same thing. The war had been won, yet the peace felt compromised. He did not suddenly adopt the bold general's worldview, but he began to understand it. He saw how focusing narrowly on ending the war had obscured the reality that wars decide more than surrender. They decide structures of power. The shift was slow, painful, largely invisible to the world. But within him, Something fundamental had changed. He was no longer asking whether the bold general had gone too far. He was asking whether he himself had not gone far enough. The meeting did not appear on any schedule. No minutes were taken. No official record would ever confirm that it happened at all. It took place quietly, among a small circle of men bound not by rank, but by trust. The cautious commander was no longer speaking as the architect of victory or the guardian of alliances. He spoke as a man unburdening himself of a truth he had carried alone for too long. There was no dramatic preface, no attempt to soften what he was about to say. He simply paused, as if measuring the weight of honesty, and then allowed it to surface. "We misunderstood the moment," he said. Those words landed heavily, not because they were loud, but because they dismantled decades of certainty. He did not blame circumstances. He did not fault subordinates. He spoke only of judgment, his own. He acknowledged that the war had demanded impossible balances, that coalition leadership required compromise. But he also admitted that compromise had exacted a cost he had failed to fully grasp at the time. The war, he realized too late, had not been only about ending a regime. It had been about shaping what replaced it. Then came the sentence no one expected him to voice. He was right. The bold general, once restrained for seeing too far beyond his remit, had understood something essential. He had recognized that restraint, when applied at the wrong moment, becomes a form of surrender to future consequences, that waiting can be as decisive as action. The room remained silent, not out of shock, but respect, for the gravity of an admission rarely made by men who once held absolute authority. This was not an apology offered to history. It was a confession offered to conscience. The meeting ended without ceremony. No one spoke of it again. But for those who heard it, the war would never look the same. History rarely asks its hardest questions out loud. It lets them linger instead, unanswered, echoing across decades. What if the moment had been seized rather than managed? What if speed had been trusted over balance, momentum over moderation? What if the bold general had been given the freedom to act when the enemy was weakest and the future still undecided? These questions do not accuse. They haunt. The cautious commander understood in his later years that history does not judge decisions by the intentions behind them, but by the worlds they create. He had acted to preserve unity, to avoid disaster, to end a war responsibly, and yet responsibility had come with consequences that stretched far beyond the battlefield. The bold general had believed that hesitation carries its own violence. That delay, when masked as prudence, can shape futures as decisively as force. He had warned that power does not wait for agreements, that reality hardens wherever action pauses. No one can say with certainty what a different choice would have produced. History allows no experiments, no second drafts. Perhaps a more aggressive path would have fractured alliances. Perhaps it would have unleashed dangers impossible to contain. These possibilities are real, and they matter. But so does what actually happened. Borders calcified. Freedoms were deferred. Generations lived under outcomes decided in rooms far from their homes, by choices made in moments when the cost of waiting was underestimated. The tragedy is not that a perfect decision was missed. It is that the question itself could only be fully understood after it was too late to answer. The bold general never lived to hear the admission. The cautious commander lived long enough to recognize it. And history remains suspended between them, asking quietly whether the safest path forward is always the wisest, and whether the moments that demand courage are often the ones most easily disguised as caution. At its heart, this story is not about who won an argument or whose strategy proved superior. It is about leadership, timing, and the quiet weight of decisions whose consequences only reveal themselves years later. The cautious commander and the bold general were not enemies. They were two men shaped by the same war, responding to the same moment with different instincts. One chose restraint to preserve unity. Believing stability could be negotiated after victory, the other chose urgency, believing that history rewards those who act when opportunity appears. Both acted in good faith. Both carried responsibility. But only one fully understood that some moments do not wait to be corrected. What makes this story endure is not the admission itself, but its timing. The realization came after borders had hardened, after lives had been reshaped by decisions made far from them, after the cost of waiting had become undeniable. The bold general never lived to hear that he had been right. The cautious commander lived long enough to understand that wisdom delayed can still be wisdom, but it cannot undo what time has already sealed. The lesson here reaches far beyond war. In our own lives, we often face moments where caution feels responsible and delay feels safe. We tell ourselves there will be another chance, a clearer signal, a less risky moment. Sometimes that is true. Often, it is not. Opportunity, like history, is unforgiving to hesitation. This story reminds us that leadership at work, in family, in personal decisions requires more than avoiding mistakes. It requires recognizing when the cost of waiting outweighs the risk of acting. It asks us to listen carefully to voices that challenge comfort, not just those that confirm it. Before we close, here's a quick question for you. Do you believe the biggest regrets in life come from actions taken or chances not taken? A. Actions taken. B. Chances not taken. Comment A or B below. And what's your perspective on this story? Do you side more with caution or with bold action when the moment feels right? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your viewpoint. If you found this story meaningful, subscribe to the channel and support our work. Your support helps us keep bringing you deeper stories that challenge how we see history and ourselves.